Hey everyone, and welcome back to Creating Appealing Characters. This is week 4, Sculpting the Head and the Face. Sculpting the head and the face is my favorite part of making any character. I really think that that's where all of the expression and personality of your character comes across, and it's kind of just my favorite little part to noodle on forever. So this week we're going to be going over some things to keep in mind while you're working on the face. Previously, we blocked out our character's body with simple Dynamesh objects in ZBrush, focusing a lot on the shapes and the specificity of those shapes. And then last week, we tied all that stuff together into one, hopefully mostly finished body sculpt. The main goal of last week was to get our body into a place where we're ready to move on to the other body parts, but also give ourselves, a couple functional subdivision levels, hopefully, with some topology that is ready for posing. So whether you did a Z-remesh and a project, or used some good topology that you had somewhere, or even did a retopology yourself, we should be good to go once we slap on some accessories ready to pose. Remember that we're going to revisit the sculpt later, so it's okay to move on to the other parts for now. Starting with the head. Just like any other part of the body that we're sculpting, we want to start simple. So we're going to start with the planes of the head. Over on the left is a great little example of some really nicely simplified planes of the head. And if you squint your eyes, you can really see how much the light affects these different planes. That's the goal that we're going for at this early stage in our sculpt. We're going to start off on the outside of the head, focusing on the overall silhouette, and then work our way inside, chunking everything out in big forms first and then getting to the details last. Over on the right, I've got the concept art for my character, and I just did a quick draw over to kind of get myself in the headspace of thinking about where the major planes of this face are going to land. So this is going to be kind of the first areas that I'll tackle when I start sculpting, and by blocking out these planes and really solidifying them in the sculpt, it'll work as a template to help me place all of the other facial elements as I go forward. Let's get into those facial elements now, starting with the eye. I want you to think of the eye area as a series of 6 lines. This first line that defines the upper eye socket. The second line defines the edge of the upper lid. The third line actually connects the lid plane to the eyeball. Those same 3 lines are mirrored on the other side of the eye. We've got the line that connects the lid plane to the eyeball, the edge of the lower lid as it transitions into this lid part, and then this line that defines the bottom edge of the eye socket. These 6 lines control the overall depth and placement of the eye, and then the thick to thin that the planes in between the lines have is what gives the eye its visual interest and helps set it into the head. Here's some really great practical examples by Philippe Farreau. Here you can see how the apexes of the lid have some impact on the directionality of the eye. So that lid shape will change based on which direction that eye is looking. Depending on the complexity of your character, you might have more overlap and anatomy in your eye, depending on how important that is on your character. I want you to think about, don't just build an eye any kind of traditional way that you know how. Think about what makes the most sense for your character. Probably most of you aren't going to be getting into secondary and tertiary wrinkles and stuff like this in the eye. Also of note is the broad variety of brow shapes that can accompany any character. So the eye and the brow are going to work together in tandem to get across a lot of the facial expression that your character will have. A lot of emotion is communicated through just these very simple lines on the face. The way that I think about the plane of the eyelid is if we take this apex here, which is our second line. Remember, here's our first line, here's our second line. Our third line is right here where that lid plane actually connects to the eyeball. But if we go from the edge of the eyelid and draw a line straight into the center mass of the eye, that is the direction that I want this lid plane to always face. There's always going to be a nice flat plane that goes from the edge of the eyelid and point directly towards the center mass of the eyeball. This is something that I'll illustrate in greater detail once we get into ZBrush. Let's move on to the nose. Just like any other part of the face, we're going to start with the major planes and then try to figure out the best way to integrate our nose into the face. So some of the most important major planes that you're going to see on any nose are this sort of flat nose bridge area. Sometimes from a side profile, it's got sort of a sweep to it. There's also this triangular plane of the nostril, and then another triangular plane, semi-triangular, kind of a trapezoid, plane of the bottom of the nose, or the bottom plane of the nose. These are sort of the main areas that we're going to focus on as we're sculpting the nose. Obviously, there's a lot of subtle plane shifts and directionality that happens throughout the nose, in a more realistic nose anyway. Your designs may vary, of course. Oftentimes, stylized characters for animation will have a much more simplified type of nose, something that reads well, but doesn't bring the face into too much of an anatomical or real world type of look. We also want to make sure that our nose is well integrated into our face. And one way that that happens is by following this nose bridge line up to the brow. You can see that there's a very strong follow through of that sharpness all the way up the brow, or all the way up the nose bridge into the brow line. So make sure that you're paying a lot of attention to that area, and that this isn't just sort of a no man's land or dead area where no real thought has gone into it. It's something I see a lot in 3D characters. Also, the way that this nasolabial line comes off of the cowl of the nostril, down past the mouth corner, and then swoops around to connect to these muscles that form the bottom parts of the lip. This sort of radial flow is super important for when this character is going to start making facial expressions and pushing the masses of the face around. Let's move on to the mouth. The lips are constructed of 5 broad interlocking shapes, like this. Again, we'll probably end up simplifying a lot of this information, but it's still important to know how they're constructed anatomically. We want to make sure that the flow of this form, as it comes down off the face, hits the lips, and then wraps around to the inside of the mouth, is working well for us and feels fleshy and well integrated into the face. And the key to doing that, for me at least, is these corners. So by giving those corners some recessed depth, just pushing that into the face gives it that nice fleshy overlap that we'll see in the next slide. But it's something that helps really ground this mouth in the face and is often overlooked when doing characters for animation. So here's a really good example. You can see the amount of overlap and depth that that mouth corner has really makes it feel fleshy and integrated, and it really is seated in the face in a nice way. If I were to do a cross section of the way that this lip works, this kind of comes around like this, and then up into the mouth area, and then back here we'd have all the teeth and gums and all that stuff. Bottom lip real quick. There's this Venn diagram like overlap of shapes, and it'll actually look a lot closer to that in 3D than it does here in the sculpt, of course. But the point is, anytime that you've got two forms that are coming together, and we're looking at it from this direction, let's say, we want to make sure that we don't just do a intersection like this, where there's just sort of a perpendicular crossing of lines. We want to make sure that as two forms come together, they turn away from the viewer slightly, which gives us exactly what's happening in this sculpt on the left. This really nice feeling of interlocking shapes, but also with a soft connection between them. One more thing to keep in note, and something I'm going to harp on a lot in the actual demo, is if we were to look at this mouth from beneath, from this angle, the curvature of these major breaks in the mouth. So our upper lip might be curved something like this. We just want to make sure that our lower lip has got something similar, but never parallel. Avoid parallels at all costs. So we might have an upper lip that's curved like this and a lower lip that has maybe a similar but more subtle type of curvature to it. And again, this is something that'll become very evident when we get into 3D. Faces in action. So now I want to talk about how moving the mouth corners around has a big impact on the rest of the face. All of the different elements of the face need to work nicely as an ensemble because they all affect each other in a major way. And so I want to show that using this TB Choi character expression exploration. The most important thing to keep in mind when doing facial expressions on your character is to not lose the volume when you're doing your sculpts. So think about how that mass is being compressed or stretched, but never actually losing volume. Let's jump into some of these expressions and I'll show you what I mean, starting with this one. So here we've got a mouth corner that's being dragged straight up into this smile pose, and this line here is indicating that overlap of that corner, that fleshy overlap. So with the mouth corner pulling up that way, this brow being pushed down, we get the feeling, this indication that this cheek is compressed, right? There's this bowing outward compression. Over on the other side of the face, where everything is much more opened up, we get an indication of that same mass of the cheek in there, but much less compressed. And the artist is being careful to make sure that this profile doesn't change too much. We're not losing volume in this face. All right, let's move on to the next one. Here's kind of the opposite example. We've got this mouth corner that's moving downward. So that coupled with the angle of this eyelid here gives an overall impression of a slope downward in this whole expression. It's a subtle kind of thing, but it's executed pretty nicely. Even the overlap of this lower lip kind of overlapping up into the upper lip here is doing a good job of showing, a forward thrusting jaw, and, all of the sort of action lines of this face are headed that way. And the last example that I want to talk about is this extreme sort of downward mouth corner. And it's, subtly implied, but all of these lines are following. And we can almost see this sort of radial shape that's being created. And you can really get away with a lot in a drawing, but remember that when we take something like this into 3D, we're going to have to figure out how these volumes work and how they are being affected by the different elements of the face, the mouth and the eyes. So it's good to know how compression and stretching are going to work in your character. And just incidentally, I want to point out that we're still very much looking at straight shapes and simple shapes versus complex. So all of our straights and curves, complex and simple, that's all still very much in play in all of these poses. It's integrated in a nice way, but we always have a very simple side in an area that we don't really care too much about, and then a much more complex side that breaks the silhouette quite a bit in the area that we do want to focus on. So think about that in your compositions while we're sculpting our faces as well. And now the ears. I found this great breakdown by Norman LeMay that really illustrates everything that I want to talk about for the ears this week. So this is a guide on how to actually draw ears, but everything that is in this little how-to is super relevant to what we're talking about. In this guide, Norman talks about keeping the ears a very simple C shape and then that interior Y shape. And that varies a lot, of course, based on what type of character you might be working on. So we've all seen this kind of very standard animation ear, right? It's like a coin ear. But the more simple that our ear gets, the more important it is to really focus on things like thick to thin and then all of these sort of tapered shapes that are happening inside the ear, regardless of how complex it's actually getting. Another thing to think about is thinking of the ear as kind of a wedge. So keeping that wedge shape as the ear comes off the side of the head, and also from the top, making sure that it kind of fans out from the side of the head. Another thing to note is that if I just quickly draw in our character here, the connection point of the ear is usually not seen from the front of the face. That's because this arch from the cheekbone here sort of covers it up from the front. So by making sure that this ear connection point is not visible from dead on, we add a little bit of depth to the face overall. The last thing I want to talk about this week is the oh shit moment, or feeling like you have no idea what you're doing. This is a point that you might come across on any project that you're working on, where no matter how many times you started a character before, or how familiar you are with the software or the techniques, it feels like you're starting from scratch, or it feels like you're back to being a beginner. And it's totally normal. I think everybody kind of goes through it. In fact, if you haven't had an oh shit moment, you're either too far into your own comfort zone, or you're not challenging yourself even a little bit on this project, or maybe you're just straight disillusioned about your own skill set. And I think that that's totally normal to have this type of feeling, and just know, try not to get too frustrated by it, and just know that by working on the basics, going back to those fundamentals and making sure that you're hitting all of that in your sculpt, you'll work through it eventually, and it'll unwrap itself and everything will look better for it. So, expect this to happen, and when it does, don't let it get you down too much. Just remember that the motto of this class is that everything looks terrible until it doesn't. So let's work through these moments and just know that everything will come together at the end. All right, it's time to get started now, sculpting the head and face. So here's where we left off after our initial blockout of the whole body. Pretty rough, but there's a little bit of planarity in there. For the sake of this demonstration today, though, I'm just going to go ahead and go back to a Dynamesh sphere and just start the whole thing over, just so that we can see the whole process from start to finish. You can see my spotlight has been updated. I've cropped the concept art down to just the face so that I can focus on that area. And then I've brought in a couple of reference images that will sort of serve as helpful inspiration, or, I just kind of like some of the facial stuff that's going on with those two images, and some of the hair too is really helpful. We're not going to focus too much on hair this week, but we will be blocking in like a general volume. So that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that I'll do is just pull this sphere around until I get the general shape that I'm looking for. So I know that the bottom half of her face, this muzzle area, is going to be pulled forward some. So I might go in and just mask that part out, blur that mask a little, and then just pull that out, making broad, kind of big changes as I go. Probably a little extreme. So just thinking about the silhouette here a little bit. What is the silhouette of this jawline? Change my selection lasso here. So the silhouette of this jaw, how that's going to come around, and then sort of just a broad idea of what the overall silhouette of this head is going to be, without adding any specific features yet. The first thing that we'll do is get a general shape going to the head. And then using an H polish brush and some mech cut brushes, I'm going to go through and just sort of plane out some of this stuff according to my planing guide that I made for myself, but also just experience of which planes I like to have defined. So definitely the side of the cranium here. And then also some major planes of the skull. Yeah, let's get this cheek plane. Some of this face just kind of flattened out in here. And excuse this junk neck geometry that's sticking through there. Just clean that up real quick. Pull that neck up into the head so we don't have to worry about it. All right, couple specific creases in the face that I find very helpful is this crease, this line that's going to be my eye line for this character. It's just going to go from corner to inside corner all the way across the whole face and sort of serve as a axial line, just like you might draw in a construction drawing of where to place the eyes. So do the exact same thing here in 3D. 3D, something like that. The next important plane for me is going to be the raised part of the cheek. See how that corresponds to the outside silhouette of my drawing. So that'll be a shape, kind of goes across the face like this. Started on it a little bit here. Let's just get a little bit more specific with it. Just really over sculpt it. So I'm looking at this silhouette and trying to compare here. And I think it's in a good place for now. Let's just keep going with it. A lot of round. This character has a lot of round features, so I want to make sure that I'm not getting concave in any areas that I don't want to be. Push this nose bridge in. Alright, something like that to start with, at least. We'll just refine as we go. The most important thing is placing these major lines where the form will be raised or affect the silhouette in some way, or this line that goes across the face, that's our eye line. All right, let's start placing some minor features here. I'm going to use an insert sphere to do that. And let's just plop in a nose. Something like that. Do the same thing to add some ears. Insert sphere. Just get a really simple ear shape going. There's just a shell. Rotate those into place. So from the top, remember from the lecture, the ears will create sort of a wedge from the front and from the top. Make sure to get that specific shape early on. Scale those down and out. Something like that. So remember, we won't see the attachment point of the ears really from dead on when we look at this character. The widest point of the face should be right here for this character. So this attachment point of where the ear actually connects to the skull is a little further back from that. And the cheeks will sort of mask that from the front. Kind of a mess back here. Let me just clean that up real quick. All right, I'm going to do a little bit of silhouette work now. Just really focusing on what the shape of this jaw, specifically jaw and cheek area, is. And right now it's feeling a little like too complex. There's too many really obvious breaks happening in there. And I want to, one thing that's affecting that is this point of the jaw right there. which is sort of becoming part of my silhouette. And for this character, it might be beneficial if you're doing like a stylized female character. Oftentimes, that bony part of the jaw won't be part of the silhouette. It'll actually be further inside, like in here, when we're looking at it from the front, because it actually wraps around from this angle. So that shape recedes from view as it goes around the side of the head. Try not to over illustrate my points here, but it's an important note, something that can help oftentimes if something isn't looking right. So looking at this break on the outside, this cheek break here, feels a little high up from where the eye line is. And also this eye line feels a little far back. So I'm going to pull this out some. And then let's bring this down a little bit. There's a couple ways we can do that. We can actually pull this geometry down. Another thing that might be affecting it is how far forward this is. So just kind of play with a few different options here. Yeah, that's already feeling better. If I kind of look at the way that lines up with the nose, it's a little lower. So right about there is where the apex of my form is going to be. The apex of the curve of that cheek. Right, something like that. Pull some of this out. All right, that's good enough for now. Let's clear my mask. And we might as well Dynamesh all this stuff together. So there we go. Get some rough areas. We can just clean those up quickly. And let's start on some individual features. I'll start with the eyes, the eye area in here first. Get those going, and then that'll help really kind of put the whole rest of the face together. So here's that nose bridge as it comes up and turns into this brow line. Just go ahead and get that roughed in. Maybe use a sharp brush to really define where that break is going to be. That's pretty rough, but it'll change. All right, so we can't do too much with the eyes until we actually have some eyes in there. So let's go ahead and do that. Bring in a polysphere here. So let's go ahead and append that polysphere. That's going to be our new eyeball. The eyes are always kind of a guessing game, just to try to figure out the exact size and placement in the head. So I'll start with one eye and get that situated pretty well, and then mirror that over, mirror the whole thing over. So if we look at the dead center of the eye, I'll just mask that so that it's easier to see. So that's the center of my eye. Now how high up and down in the head the eye goes is important because I want that apex of this curvature to be, that's kind of exactly where the pupil's going to be, right there in the center. If you were to imagine like that. So I want to make sure that there's more curvature towards the bottom like this. See how I'm raising that apex up. I don't want it to, the point is I don't want it to, the eye shouldn't feel like it's craning upwards like this, like rotating backwards in the socket. This upper lid is going to be further forward than the lower lid, so I want to keep that in mind as I'm placing the eye in here. Don't place the eye too low. And then just jumping back and forth between the body here, or the head I should say. Jump back and forth between the head and the eyeball to situate this eye in place. Might be a little small. I'm going to scale it up some, raise it up some. Just make sure that it's not too far forward in the head. Should be good. I just want to show very specifically what I'm thinking about when I'm making an eye, starting with how to set it into the head. How deep does that eye go? And what markers can you use to help place this eye? So imagine if we're looking at this in profile, this is our eyelids and our eyeball. So just imagine that there's also a forehead and a nose and a mouth. Okay, so there's our whole face, just kind of invisibly floating in there. So as we look backwards in depth towards the eyeball, the first point that we should hit is this upper lid. So if I draw my transpose straight down, you'll notice that that is the furthest forward point of the whole eyelid. If I hide the actual eyeball, we'll see that the next furthest forward point is the lower lid, and then the interior corner, and then the exterior corner. If you always follow this order of depth, then your eye will be placed into the head much easier. It'll feel much more natural. You'll notice that if I take this eyelid that I made and just change that order a little bit, just rotating this back some. So now the lower lid is further forward than that upper lid, and it just makes it feel like we're looking at it from underneath, or like the eye is sort of automatically pointing up at some kind of angle. It just it kind of feels unnatural, and so sometimes when you're sculpting an eye, you might feel like it's not quite sitting right in the face, and oftentimes it's just a balance of where you've got these points situated in the depth of the face. So just keep that in mind and check it as you go, because sometimes it'll come out of whack as you're sculpting. Just snap that back. Another thing I want to show real quick is that this plane of the lid, as it goes around, connects to the eye here, is always pointing directly in towards the center of that eyeball. So if I center my transpose here and just use that to sort of illustrate what I'm talking about. So I've got this transpose line perfectly in the center of this eyeball. So it's just a straight line drawn out from there. No matter which way I move this along that eyelid, this plane always points directly in towards the center of the eye. That just makes it very predictable for when you go in to start adding detail work. Like if I'm shaping this eye a little bit, remember we want to have thick to thin on this plane as we sculpt, so thicken this area up here maybe, depending on your character, of course. So that just makes a nice curvature from thin to thick. That's an over-exaggeration, but that's kind of what that lid plane is doing. But always it's pointing in directly towards the center of that eyeball. Okay, so if you keep your eyes constructed something like this, then it'll be a lot less guesswork when it comes to how they fit into the head in general. All right, let's get back to the rest of that demo. Now I can shape the eye socket around the sphere of the eyeball. All right, let's try that. It's pretty rough still, but that's all right. We're going to be making a lot of little adjustments to this area because it's very important. So it's hard to tell if we're totally correct yet, so let's go ahead and add a eyelid. So the way I'm going to do that is just by using the curve tube brush. And a couple things I want to change real quick. If I go to the stroke palette, this is a curve brush. I'm going to have it go ahead and lock the start and snap so that it goes and snaps to the surface as I draw it. Let's go ahead and draw out our upper eyelid. Maybe it doesn't snap to the surface. That's okay, we can move it around. You don't have to be too particular at this point because we're going to move this around quite a bit. If you change your cursor size and then click on the curve again, it'll update the size of that tube that it's drawn out. And that's fine. Let's go with a larger, just a thick tube like that. Here's why I like using curved tubes to do this. It gives me a pretty low res tube that I can move around. But one thing that's really nice is it gives us a consistent edge. So we can use a brush like the Metka brushes to sharpen up that edge and define our lid plane. So I'll just drag that over there a couple times. You have to be super accurate with it. And that gives us now two planes to mess with. for that eyelid. Very quick and easy. It's very low res, so it's easy to control. So I'll just get this into shape here. So if you remember from the lecture, we're thinking about the eyes or the eyelids as a series of lines. So we've got this line that connects our eyelid to the eye socket. We've got this line, which is the start of our inner eyelid plane, and we've got this line that actually connects to the eyeball. So that's what we're dealing with right now. So taking a look at the concept again, I know that her eyes are in kind of an expression, but they have, there's a break up here on the upper inside corner of the eye, and then this outer corner is about even, maybe a little higher than the inside corner. If I were to draw that invisible line from outside corner to inside corner to inside corner back to outside corner, we get a slight U shape like that. So I want to keep that in mind. That lines up pretty well with this eye line that I've already sculpted in there. So, go slow on the face. Take your time setting this stuff up. I find that it always pays off to be a little bit meticulous about laying these forms in. Set yourself up for success by taking some extra time to really think about the meridians of the face. That sounds like some fancy speak. Anyway, we're not going to go crazy yet with dealing with thick to thin, but it's always nice to get a little bit of that going. I don't want this to be totally parallel as it goes all the way around. So I might pull up some of this on the inside, push down some of this on the outside, and really taper it off. I'm readjusting my eye socket. I'm going to raise that eyebrow ridge a little bit. And then going back to what I said about convex and concave shapes on this character in particular, decided I want to reduce the amount of scooping that's happening on the inside socket here. So just lightly, I'm going to define that brow ridge. I want that to feel more like the apex point of a curve rather than a really hard break. And that's going to help with this sort of shape that's happening in my concept there. Pull some of this forward. All right, so don't do too much fixing. Let's go back to the eyelid here. All right, let's make a second lid. So right back to curved tube. Let's draw our second tube on here. That's huge. Scale this down. Maybe up a little bit. Good. And I'm making it a little bit longer than the actual area that I need to cover, and here's why. So I'm going to pull this whole thing out and then push it underneath that upper lid so that it feels like that upper lid is overlapping slightly. That just helps set the eye in a little bit better, that overlap. So I'm going to do the same planing. I'm going to do the same planing here that I did on the upper lid. All right, there's our lower lid set in. There's a lot of shape work that needs to happen, but it's in there. We can start pushing and pulling stuff around. So I'm going to do just that. First thing I'm going to do is let's dynamesh this now into the head. Let's just incorporate all this stuff. I'm going to go over here where I don't have an eye and poke some of this stuff back just to get it out of the way. All right, that should be fine. Let's see what that gives us. So that's pretty crappy resolution. So I'm just going to crank that resolution a little bit to help me out. Okay, that's workable, I think, for what I need. Actually, I'm going to do just a little bit more. Let's change that to like a little higher. Okay, that didn't make a whole lot of difference, but that's perfectly fine for what we need. So our resolution is going to be increasing a little bit as we get all these pieces in here. But just like we did with the body, we're going to stop at a certain point, give ourselves some subdivision levels and some better topology, and then keep going. So I'm just using my cut brush, fill in some areas here and sculpt out, or using that cut brush to define some areas rather. And then we can do some adjustments overall on our eyelid shape. It's feeling a little large, feeling like this break might be a little bit too far out. So pull that over. It's almost straight up and down in the concept here. Pull that over some. And then from there, right where that break is happening, just simplifying the rest of this lid. And on the bottom here is feeling a little droopy. So just pulling that up. I don't want to take too much cheek with it. Let's try that. And to keep it from getting too scooped out, I'm going to fill in some of this area here. Just fill that into the cheek. Helps incorporate that eye a little bit. This is what I'm looking for, is this stair-stepping from the eye into the cheek, the eyelid into the cheek. All right. Got eyelids now. So getting that structure, I find it's always helpful to get that structure in there. Get some good solid thick shapes to help define your eyelids, and then go in and do all of your adjusting, because now you've got all the pieces are there and you can do the work of actually making it fit the concept. Just a little bit more adjusting there, and I think we'll call that good for this pass at the eye. So that's in there, it's roughly the right shape and size, but we're going to get some other elements of the face in there before we make any final decisions about the eye or any big choices there. So last thing I'll do is mirror my eyeball, and make sure that when you're doing this you rename that. If it's called polysphere, just call it eye or something, and that's because when you use Subtool Master to do a mirror, sometimes it'll screw up if the naming is off or weird in some way. Alright, so now we've got eyes. And it doesn't look anything like our character yet, but that's part of the process. So I'm just going to make a couple of quick adjustments to the overall eye shape. Try and get it a little closer to the concept before we move on to some other features. Alright, that should be good for now. Let's move on to the nose. Alright, the nose. So the nose, I'm going to keep really simple for now, just like everything else. It's important that the nose feels like it sits on this plane or this mass of the face. So this line here is going to be very important to me as the nose goes up and into the eye socket area. So the first thing I'll look at is the concept art where the nose breaks. Where does that bridge break? And it looks pretty close to me here in the sculpt. So I'm just going to widen this a little bit, maybe fill in some of this area ever so slightly. Punch some nostrils in. Use Dam Standard to help me carve in my nostril cowls a little bit, just kind of like sketching over the model. It can be handy too to start putting in that nasolabial line. Don't always segment off each piece of the face as I sculpt. Usually I'll jump around a lot as I go. Just jump from one piece to another, but helps to demonstrate, I think, just isolating each individual element. Focus on one thing at a time. And then once everything is in there, we can push and pull stuff around and do all the fixing. Always remember to look at your model from top and bottom as you go. It's amazing how much information you can get out of those views and how often overlooked that is. So just defining this bottom plane of the nose. She's got a very simple nose, relatively. So don't need to add a ton of detail. Alright, something like that is fine for our initial block out. One thing I like to do is just go in and sharpen up these breaks here and the contact point of the nose with the rest of the face. Just make a nice sharp crease there. And look at how the nose is curving on this muzzle here. That'll change a little bit too as we get to the mouth, which we're going to do next. Once I'm happy with that bottom plane and some of those breaks, I can go back in and just soften up that line a little bit. That's good enough for now. Let's get some mouth going. So you'll have to decide on your character if you need to have an open mouth or if you're going to go and just sculpt the lips closed. I find that it's probably best to just put an open mouth into your character because that helps with that interlocking lip pattern as they come together. It's a little bit more convincing, and you never know. If you need to be able to open the mouth later, it's a big pain to do if you don't have supporting topology, so let's do it now. So the way that I'm going to do that is the same way I've done everything else on the face by using insert sphere. So if I use insert sphere with Alt held down, it will do a reversed insert sphere if I turn on double-sided. So this is an inside-out sphere. This is what you should be seeing if you want to try and punch a hole using Dynamesh rather than add. And I'm just going to just bear with me for a sec while I make this weird shape. So this shape is going to represent the shape of the opening in this mouth that I want. Great, something like that. You don't have to spend a ton of time on that. Alright, so we'll clear the mask and rerun our Dynamesh. Great, now we have a hole that looks terrible punched into our face. But that's alright, we'll just clean it up now. So that looks very odd, right? So just imagine that this is our mouth without lips, which it is. First thing I want to do is just push these corners straight back into that face, correct the resultant hole here, smooth it out. A general curvature to that. That looks super good. Now I'll just use my clay tubes to just build up back around that mouth a little bit. But before we go too far, adding any kind of sculptural detail to that, let's put some lips in there. The way I'm going to do that is, again, by using curved tubes. You can also just sculpt it out, but I find that sometimes it's nice to be able to just tack this volume on and then adjust it. That's being very uncooperative. Start from the middle, draw it out. That's a little better. Alright, whatever. We're just going to mangle it anyway. Clear my mask, or actually click on the model to get rid of your curve mode. And just like with the eyes, we're going to use this upper lid as an overlap, or upper lip. I think I said lid. Let's just get a general shape. Not worried that these are two different tubes. That's okay. This character doesn't have a lot of that one shape interlocking triangle piece here in the middle and then another shape over here. It's more like a one just continuous shape like this. So don't add any extra detail if you don't need to. Alright, that's totally good for now. Excuse my weird everything going on here. It'll all come together. Curved tubes. I'm going to use inflate to just get some more volume out of this. And make sure that that's tucked into that upper lip. All right. I'm going to mask off those lips and just do a little quick cleanup on this area around, such as building up some of these muscles here, pulling this chin out some. I'm going to fill in the rest of this, just pull this muzzle down into these lips, like that. That's good, we can clean this up now. So I'm going to re-Dynamesh to incorporate this structure. Some of that gets lost, but that's alright. That's an opportunity to sculpt more. Alright, I'm going to go through and just kind of help out some of the planes that surround the mouth a little bit, like where that chin's going to be, and where I'm going to fill in some of this gap. And don't forget to do some overlap on the corners there. See how that's already feeling like a little bit fleshy? Let's keep that up. Alright, now we've got a bunch of features sitting on a face, and they don't look anything like the concept. So, but everything is in there. We can start moving some stuff around now to try to match up the actual exact proportions and lines and stuff that are happening in our concept art. Well, we have the pieces in here, but they're not playing well together yet. So I'm going to go across this model real quick, make some adjustments, and get all this stuff working better together. To do that, I'm going to be looking at, of course, my concept art here, but just really specifically the distances between things and the silhouette line here and how that corresponds to the placement and the depth of all of these different elements. If you have an opportunity to get some of the facial expression in now, you should do it. If it's symmetrical, anyway, if it's a change that you can make that's symmetrical. I think I'm missing a lot of volume on the side of the head here, just making everything feel kind of compressed towards the center of the face. Adding that volume out helps a little bit there. Now if I'm looking at the silhouette of this chin, something isn't quite adding up. Let's push some of this up. Get a little bit more of a sharper U shape, I think. Sometimes it also helps to turn off shadows, or maybe switch to a different material so you can see the form that you're working with a little easier. This head doesn't really line up with the neck anymore. That's okay. Not really looking at the neck. We can worry about the neck later. So one of the main curvatures that I'm looking at is this curvature of the cheek and how that transfers down into the mouth area and then ultimately into the chin as well. So I want to make sure that this nose feels like it's sitting on that curve. This mouth feels nicely integrated. It's kind of in there now, but really that curve starts all the way up here in the eye, and then there's a step into that eyelid. But this is that sort of nice round shape that I want to see as I rotate this model all the way around. You can see it starts to get a little bit flat from this angle. And then there's some kind of weird overlap with the eye and stuff on this side. So rotate around your model as you're sculpting and be on the lookout for how the curvature of the face changes as you get to these different angles. It's possible that these eyes need to be adjusted. They might be a little large. They might be a little small, actually. I'm going to try scaling them up some and then moving them back just a tiny bit to try and help with the way that this eye is wrapping around the face. Alright, sometimes adding some specificity in here, sharpening up some of these edges, controlling some of my edge quality will help get rid of the ambiguous areas around these features. Like, look at this area is very lumpy and strange still. So let's try and fix that by being really decisive with the shapes that I am going with. Checking to make sure that those eyelids wrap around the eye in a way that makes sense, that they sort of continue that curvature of the big sphere. Still not sure about the general size of those eyes. They might be a little askew still. Get a little bit more specific with my brow ridge. So I'm just going to keep doing this on this model, just rotating around from different angles, sharpening things up, making sure that my forms are reading as I rotate the model around, and constantly comparing, checking what I've done against the concept art. Throw some simple color on there real quick. I also like to turn on wax preview just a little bit, give myself a little bit of the illusion of subsurface, especially as I'm working on skin. Never forget that you can always cross-section into your model and do some work in there. That's very handy, especially for areas like the mouth corners and the mouth bag here. Get some depth. I also like to check to see what the profile of my lip is. Some nice, get some thickness to those so that they're not just this shape all the way through. That feels alright. Real quick, I just want to throw some very simple color on here because I find that color is a useful compositional element. I use it to check proportions a little bit, and also the sooner I can start making this feel at least a little bit alive, the better for me. Start to feel that character a little bit. I haven't even sculpted the ears yet. We'll just throw a little bit of blood in there. Darken the area around the eyes just a little bit. We're going to get into more specific coloring stuff later. It's way too much. Back that way off. Just want to get a little bit darker around the eyes. Get a sense for that. Color the inside of that white so that I don't have to build teeth just yet. I'll probably do that in a few. Throw some simple colors on those lips. Purpose being just to check, just to use that to check proportions a little bit. I find that to be very useful. A white inside the mouth kind of tricks my eyes into thinking that that's teeth. Alright, so we're getting closer. The color makes a huge difference, I think. So, next thing I'm going to do, build another polysphere. Now, let's insert that polysphere, and let's just rough in some hair. Just as color can be useful as a compositional element on the face, the hairline is also super important, obviously. So we want to just represent that really. Right now, I don't want to do too much more than that. Just figure out a really simple hair, really more of a volume, like a proxy. I'm just going to go ahead and fill that with orange. So, without getting too specific on the hair, we'll just get a general volume going to be revisited later. Alright, something like that for now. Definitely come back to that later. Turn shadows back on to get that wax preview effect. Alright, let's do a few more things to this hair real quick. I'm going to go ahead and Dynamesh that and just get some directionality going. So obviously there's a lot more we still have to sort out with this hair, but it's handy to have it in there because we can use every element that we have going to judge proportion and distance. Very useful. So I'm really feeling like with the addition of this hair proxy, the space between the eye and the ear probably a little bit too forward. So go back to my head, push this ear back some. I'm really going to round out the bottom of this jaw. Not a lot of hard features on her face. Just jumping back and forth between the head and the hair, just to fix some silhouette stuff. It's feeling better. This is feeling a little receding to me, so I'll just pull that hair proxy forward. I'll just pull that hair proxy forward to get rid of that overarching bump there. I kind of see it sticking out over there, which I like. I want to try and preserve that if I can. If it makes sense. It is not easy to get that profile working. Sometimes you'll notice that it's very easy to cheat stuff in a drawing. Some things don't always line up very well when you get them into 3D. So it's our job to make it look like the same character still, even though obviously not every single line that you make, or every single line in the concept, I should say, will translate directly to something in 3D. Alright, that's enough for the hair for now. I'm sure we'll jump back and forth to that. But I'm going to leave it for now and go back to the face. Moving that hair around has shown me that these ears are feeling a little bit too big. Let's work on those some. Just reduce those. If I can get a better shape in the model here than I have in the concept, we might as well start sculpting in the specific shapes of that ear too. Start by hollowing this out, double check what's happening, make sure that we're not poking through the back. It's a good thing to check. Push and pull all the stuff that I need. We're pretty much out of resolution in the ears. That's alright, get as close as we can. So you'll notice I stay pretty low with my Dynamesh, partially as a safety net for myself so I don't go overboard. Sculpting detail forces you to think about the larger shapes. Alright, let's get a few more pieces going on here. I think one piece that's really going to help a lot is getting those eyebrows in there. And to do that, I like to use the topology brush and just simply draw them on. Great. I'm going to turn those into their own subtools. Alright, just trying to get some of the specific shapes that are happening with those brows in this very low res version of them. Alright, that feels alright. Okay, now we're going to do another pass of just going over this whole face, adjusting some proportions, fixing things, and getting all these different elements to play a little bit better. This mouth is feeling extra super wide to me. These eyes feel a little bit large, especially from this angle. I'm going to fix those real quick, and we'll just keep going. The good news is it's starting to get closer to the concept, so, like I said, just stick with it and keep pushing and pulling. If something isn't working, think about why it's not working. Have you measured the correct distances? In my case, a lot of things were just floating around on the face and didn't really have a relationship. They weren't structured in the same way that they are in the drawing. So you may find at a certain point during your head sculpt or body sculpt or any other thing that you're working on that you're coming to the end of Dynamesh being useful. So Dynamesh is really only good for putting in your volumes and getting the general shape and forms working for you. It's not really too good past that. You don't want to really add subdivisions to a Dynamesh because you're just going to end up with a ton of extra detail. So, here's as far as I got with my Dynamesh, but you can see that there's certain areas in here where it's just getting very light. And even though the polygons are evenly distributed across this whole mesh, they don't flow with there's no supporting structure. There's no flow to this topology at all. And so all of these features are suffering a little bit of detail because of that. So in order to get in order to get to the next level with this sculpt to where I can start adding some refined edges and some sharper detail where I need it, I need to get that supporting topology in there. Kind of like we did with the body, only it's much more important on the face. It's very specific the way that we want that to work. So let's go ahead and get this mesh or get this sculpt ready for some retopology. So the first thing that I'll do is just let's just evaluate what we have and see what's going to work for us and what isn't. So right off the bat, I think the main point that is going to be a pain point for us is this mouth. So Z-Remesher does not like this type of shape because it can't tell where the loop should be. It's a little easier for it to figure out stuff like this eye because there's like a sharp, consistent edge that goes all the way around that. Nose and ears and stuff are usually okay for us. It usually does a pretty good job right out of the box, but we're going to help it out a little bit this time. So I'll duplicate this off. So now I've got an extra object in here. And I'm going to use this to create some good topology and then reproject this where necessary back onto my old mesh. So I'm going to go ahead and fix this mouth problem. Just I don't want to totally mangle everything that I have here, but I want to make it easier for myself to create a loop. So here's what I mean. We want to turn that into more of a rounded mouth shape. And while we're in here, we might as well take advantage of this time to sculpt out this mouth bag a little bit. Just give me a little bit extra room in there. Here's an important area, the inside of the mouth. If you look at the corner of this mouth, the way that this cheek is going to curve around, we have an opportunity while we're in here to refine that shape some. Give it a nice curve, a nice fleshiness to that cheek, a thickness that helps it feel a little bit believable. We want our lips and our mouth to have usually it's easy to go very thin in those areas. So specifically this corner is what I'm going to try to fix up for myself. I'm just going to kind of blur it out a lot until I get this rounding that it's doing. Just kind of obliterate some of this detail and sculpt this roundness in.
hopefully that'll work for me. And smooth everything out quite a bit. Remember, we're just going to use this mesh to generate better topology. So only obliterate the areas that you think won't work or cause some kind of trouble. Just going to do something like that because I really want a nice round curvature when I go to retop this, or use the Z-remesh rather. Okay, that's alright for now. I'm going to leave the rest of this alone. I think it'll work for me pretty well. That mouth is the main part that I'm worried about. So the next thing to do is to assign some polygroups. Assigning the different polygroups will help maintain rings when we go to use Z-remesher. Alright, so here we have a bunch of polygroups that I've assigned to this head, just based on major topological landmarks or islands that I think should be concentric rings, or would just help to have a flow in a certain direction. So imagine that each of these groups is going to hopefully do its own sort of ring. Let's find out. So what I'm going to do is go down to my Z-remesher and turn on keep groups. And let's just crease this up to maybe 6. Hit Z-remesher and see what happens. Alright, so let me turn on my wireframe here. That's pretty good. So what we get out of this is concentric rings around the eyes. Very handy for maintaining that structure. We get a pretty decent ring around the mouth. This is not exactly perfect for what I might want, but you can always sort of adjust this sculpt a little bit. Just kind of smooth this down to very, very simple. And then fix any other areas that are a little wonky. And yeah, looks pretty good. Smoothing stuff out a little bit. I really like how it handled all this. This area here is kind of strange, so it's never totally perfect, of course, but this is a heck of a lot closer than just letting Z-remesher run on its own algorithm. That will burn you. Alright, let's try keeping the same number of polygons and running Z-remesher again with groups turned on. Alright, some stuff better, some stuff worse. Let's try the alternate Z-remesher algorithm. So by holding Alt and clicking Z-remesher, it'll run a different type of algorithm. Super bad? Okay, so that didn't work. Really, this isn't too terrible. I don't love the way that this is flowing, but that's pretty much without getting in and just constantly fiddling with Z-remesher controls. It's not horrible. Yeah, we'll definitely be able to get a decent structure here. And since these corners are going to be heavily sculpted over and kind of buried in my face anyway, I don't really care too much about it. Plus, this would be super easy to just jump into Maya or some other program and fix. You could just fix that topology fairly simply. So yeah, for some reason I can never get mouths to work very well. But this is pretty decent for eyes, and this whole face area now is going to be much easier to sculpt. It's also much lower resolution than my old Dynamesh, and I can add a couple subdivision levels to this so that I have really, really good control over sharp areas and soft areas. Alright, so now I've got this mesh which has got good topology and it's ready to go. And I can project this on top of my old Dynamesh which has all of my detail. And then just move around these different, just show you real quick. So if I just pull out this stuff here, just kind of move this topology into place where I want it. Nose is a good example. And then do a project. So I project all, and then just keep shifting stuff around until it's where I want it. And project all again. And so on and so forth until you've got your topology lined up really nicely with your detailed Dynamesh sculpt. And then from there, you can just keep sculpting. So let's jump ahead now to where I end up with this face. Okay, so here we are after a little bit more time pushing and pulling points around and just finessing my shapes a little bit better. This is where I landed. This is where I'm at for the head this week, and I think it's in a good spot for now. I'm sure I'll want to come back once all the body pieces are in here and start to, or at least just finish up some minor detailing and stuff on here. But we're definitely in a great place as far as getting close to that character and the feel of that character to some degree. So I do want to just kind of do a breakdown real quick of the progress that I've made on this sculpt, and talk about specifically the type of stuff that I spent time detailing out. So let's go ahead and take a closer look here. The first thing that you'll notice is a lot of that initial plane work that I did really came into play and is coming back into to surface through this model in different places. If I just do a quick drawing on the surface here, you'll notice that there's a nice plane that kind of goes all the way through the face like that. You can see where that light is hitting. So this is the kind of stuff I'm looking at as I'm sculpting, is just getting this nice flow. If having some sort of an abstract shape like this moving through your character's face doesn't make sense for your character, then leave it out. But I think you can find in most characters some sort of follow through line, something that sort of acts as a line to hold together all of the features of the face. So I've got one kind of going through there. And I paid a lot of attention to areas where the edges are very sharp, like on the chin here, and then like of course this cleft in the chin here. The edges of the lips are sharper, and then there's areas where it tapers off and gets a little softer. And also this nose ridge is going from soft to a sharper edge as that transitions up here into the brows. And actually I just noticed that my lashes aren't visible. So adding things like eyebrows and eyelashes obviously goes a long way towards bringing that character out. There's a lot more expressiveness that comes through on the face when you add those elements. So I like to get those things in early if I can, and then see how they affect the overall silhouette of your eyes, see how they look from all different angles. One other point I want to talk about is the follow through of shape on the face. So just like any other part of the body, it's important that if we see our face from one angle, that it still feels like the same face as we rotate around to other angles. So for example, if I just take a look at the face in profile here, and just starting with the bottom curvature of this eye, you'll see that this lid sweeps down. There's a stair step into the cheek, stair step right there. And then there's this nice S curve that defines that cheek and goes all the way through down into the jaw. And as I rotate this model around, you'll notice that that curvature maintains all the way through to different angles. So even at this kind of far extreme back 3/4, we still have this S shape going all the way through the face. And so, I work really hard to maintain this volume, having the same look as I rotate around in space. That's pretty nice. And also, one thing you'll notice as I go to like a bottom view here, that curvature of that cheek maintains, it's a nice, even curvature all the way around. So we don't get a lot of uh, like surface dimpling and flattening in different areas. I just go around the whole model. Like that's what takes all this time, is just going around the whole model and smoothing out dents and making sure that these major forms are reading really well as I rotate around. You'll notice that I really pushed these corners of this mouth back quite a bit to get the feeling of depth and fleshiness on those cheeks.
and I think that that's working pretty well. That definitely supports and helps out this S curve shape that's happening as the cheek goes down into the mouth. Yeah. Speaking of the mouth, let's take a closer look here from underneath. I talked a little bit about in the lecture, just breaking up symmetry and parallels wherever you can. So this top lip curvature is a lot more of like a horseshoe shape, and this bottom lid curvature, you'll notice, is got more of a emphasized breaking point right here. So there's kind of a more boxy look to it, and it doesn't affect the way that that lip looks too much from any other angle other than sort of these more extreme angles. But you can imagine if these were totally parallel, it would be kind of boring and not super beneficial. So yeah, try to break up those parallels wherever you can. Getting your eyes to wrap around the face is very important. This is one of the hardest parts of doing the face, I think, is getting those eyes to feel like they wrap from corner to corner and then continue around the side of the head, especially on a lot of stylized characters that might have like very large eyes. So you might have to play around with that some, but just know, like, if you're looking at your character and something looks really off, something just isn't coming across, please consider that. It's probably your issue is probably in the eyes or the cheek or bone structure kind of that you have set up in your face. So, you know, just like we talked about in our lecture, making sure that, this upper lid is the first point that we hit as we look backwards into the head. The lower lid is the second point that we hit, followed by the interior corner and then the exterior corner. You shouldn't see your eye, like this hole shouldn't look like, you know, this. Like, what I'm saying is it shouldn't be super shallow. You want to pull these corners back so that and that'll give your whole face a nice feeling of curvature. Okay, that's it for this week. So your homework is to take your face to a level about on par with what I got out of my character this week. Always keep in mind everything that we talk about in the lecture is very important. So work large to small, as in all things. Start with the major planes of your face because that will be the foundation, the building blocks as you go forward. You'll notice I never jump into detail until the very, very last few pieces. The last couple minutes of sculpting really are the only times I go into detail stuff. But I'm always paying attention to the major forms, that structure that you build up underneath, and how I treat my edges if I'm going sharp on certain parts and soft on others, and the transition of sharp to soft along those edges. Of course, at any point during the face sculpt, you might find that you're due for some extra resolution. So feel free to do a Z-remesh or whatever you need to do to get that extra resolution. But bear in mind that we're going to be combining all of these different parts in the next couple steps. So the body, the hands, the face. So don't get too precious with your topology at this point. I'll usually use something like Z-remesher to give myself just a couple extra subdivision levels, but getting that important sort of support structure in there so that my sculpt is accurate. That's really the most important part at this point. So again, the homework is to sculpt out the face to something like this level. It should really start to feel like your character this week. Add in eyebrows and eyelashes where necessary, and just pull all those different elements together and have fun. We'll see you next week.